Welcome back to the Alabama Woodworker. My name is Hui. Today I'm going to be talking to you about my traditional workbench. While my multifunctional outfeed assembly table is great for my many machine tool type operations, I wanted a workbench that was specific for hand tool use. Before building this workbench, I had three goals in mind. One, it had to be easy to construct with readily available materials. Two, it had to fit my height and my stature. And three, it had to fit my needs for hand tool use. I'll be talking to you about the materials that I used, the dimensions of the workbench, the construction of the workbench, the clamping elements, and its functionality. The base for my workbench is constructed of number 1 Southern Yellow Pine. Now, number 1 stands for the fact that it's the best quality Southern Yellow Pine that you could probably find, with the fewest knots and the fewest voids. I'm lucky enough and fortunate enough to have a lumber yard here in the Huntsville area, in my case Decatur, Alabama, that has their own supply of air-dried Southern Yellow Pine. This company supplies a lot of lumber to timber framers and construction companies and has no problem selling to the general public. Thankfully, I have that, and I was able to get a really nice Southern Yellow Pine. But by all means, you can get spruce pine fir blend from Lowe's or Home Depot. But I recommend that you look in your area and see where your timber framers and construction companies are getting their lumber from. Total, I got about 8 of these 2x10 boards that were ripped in half to make the legs. 8 of those at 10 feet long. Total cost, about $33. The top of my workbench is constructed from 8-quarter rock maple, which is readily available at one of my hardwood supplies here called American Hardwood Supply in Tony, Alabama. The top used a little under 50 board feet, and it came out to a little under $3 a board foot. So you can estimate how much the top costs. But by all means, you can use ash, Douglas fir, Southern Yellow Pine, or even spruce pine fir blend from Lowe's or Home Depot. The hard maple, I chose the hard maple because I wanted a really hard, solid surface with quite a bit of heft to it. But by all means, use what's available in your area. After I made the tabletop for my workbench, I then made my Vise Chops. Unfortunately, I didn't have thick enough hard maple left over to create the chops of the vise. So what I did was I took cherry, which I had plenty of, and I laminated those to the rock maple, the hard maple. And I'm actually happy that I did it because it gave a really nice accent color to the maple top. I painted the base with General Finishes lamp black milk paint, and I finished the top with a wipe-on oil poly blend. Now, many will argue that you only need boiled linseed oil with the tabletop, and they're probably right about that. But I chose to have just that little bit of added protection that a wipe-on oil poly blend would have over just a boiled linseed oil. Now, for the top, I only used 1 coat, so this is a very thin coat, and if I need to resurface this, a light sanding and a hand plane would do all that I need for resurfacing. The base is painted with 2 coats of milk paint, and that milk paint was actually thinned about 20% because it's pretty thick when it comes out of the can. Thinning it 20% was actually a smart idea. It made it actually flow a lot better, and it leveled out really nicely, and it dried actually fairly fast as well. The workbench measures 22 1/8 wide by 54 3/4 inches long by 31 7/8 tall. With the chop, the workbench is 24 1/8 inches wide. As you can see, the workbench height comes to my wrist. When it came to estimating the length of the workbench, I took my hand plane close to my hip and I extended my arms all the way out prior to needing to take a step. I then added that length with the length of my inset vise, and I came out with the total length of my workbench. The workbench top is a solid 4 inches thick. The legs in the stretchers are constructed of southern yellow pine laminated together, measuring 4 inches by 5 inches. The total height of the base comes to 27 7/8 of an inch, and the interior shelf, which is 3/4 inch birch ply, measures 15 by 29 inches. Construction of the top was fairly easy. I had 9-inch wide 8/4 maple boards that I ripped on the bandsaw to approximately 4 1/4 inches wide. I then squared 4 sides to a little over 4 1/8 inches and laminated 4 5-inch sections together. After the glue dried on those laminations, I then went back to the joiner and the planer and got it down to a little over 4 1/16 of an inch, and then laminated those 5-inch sections together. Finally, I took that big top, this big top, to a workshop here locally that I knew had a 24-inch planer, and I finished the planing to final dimension of 4 inches. I wanted the jaws of my vise to be completely removable and replaceable. So what you'll see here is actually the rear jaw of the vise separate from the workbench top. The rear jaw is attached by a barrel bolt that goes through the bottom of the workbench top and a bed bolt that goes through the rear jaw and intersects the barrel bolt. Here you can see that there are 4 of them. On the base, I used traditional mortise and tenon to connect the stretchers, the upper and lower stretchers, to the legs. I was fortunate enough to get a hold of a mortiser at a local workshop, community workshop here in Huntsville. After I cut the mortises for the legs, I then cut the tenons on my table saw here at home. I then drilled holes for the drawbores and dry assembled everything. Used the same drill bit that I used to cut the holes within the legs to mark the holes on the tenons. I then disassembled everything and then offset those holes by a 1/16 of an inch. When I reassembled when I got ready to glue everything up, I clamped everything together and then drove the pegs for my drawbores through, and that made the cheeks of the stretchers tight up against the leg, and I didn't have to use clamps after that. So this might be really difficult to see, but I feel like it's important to mention. The tabletop is attached to the stretchers of the base using machine bolts. What I did was I bored oversized holes and used an undersized washer for the major diameter here, and I tapped the holes within the tabletop and attached those machine bolts. The oversized holes allowed the workbench top to expand and contract with seasonal changes. And quite frankly, I think it's a really, really, really good method to attach a workbench top that's of this size. I know a lot of woodworkers that have done this. In fact, actually, Benchcrafted Hardware recommends that you tap hardware screws into wood. And quite frankly, if the holes are oversized properly, you really shouldn't have an issue with wood movement ripping your stretchers apart. Sorry for the shaky camera work, but this was the best way for me to get an angle to show you guys how this was put together. Prior to figuring out what vise I wanted on the front of my workbench, I scoured Craigslist to see what was available in terms of vices on the used market. And I'm really happy that I did. I happened to stumble across a Veritas twin screw vise being sold by a fellow woodworker who just didn't like the vise for some reason, and he was selling it for $50. That's right, he was selling it for $50. The only issue was that it was missing the front cover, and the chain that came with this twin screw vise was used to accommodate the 2 screws 16 inches apart on center. So I bought a 24-inch cover kit, which actually came with a chain to accommodate 24 inches separating on center of the screws. The vise works flawlessly. And better yet, it is an extremely strong vise. What's really great is having all of that space, 24 inches between the screws. Now I don't have to worry like with a bench vise or maybe even some of the cast iron vises, having that screw in the center of your clamping space, which now you have to skew off to the side if you want to do dovetails, if you're doing like sort of a wide panel and dovetailing a wide panel. Now you have 24 inches between those screws and full clamping capability. The other great thing is that you can also clamp a piece on its edge to do edge joining. And lastly, there are dog holes along the front of the vise and also within the tabletop. And that allows dog holes to be placed, and now I have another clamping option to clamp a board face down to do any sort of face jointing or to do any chopping operations that might be going in the vertical direction. My other clamping mechanism is my Veritas Inset vise. This vise was extremely simple to install. It is just 2 routed channels that the inset vise sits into, and then it's screwed down with 6 screws. This little jaw is put into the carriage of the vise and is able to squeeze a piece of wood between another dog hole and that jaw. This is great when you want to do tooling operations on the face of your workpiece. The last clamping element on my workbench is my Holdfast. Now I have a Veritas Holdfast, but by all means any Holdfast would work on this workbench. It is simply just 3/4 inch dog holes that are drilled within the workbench, and that allows me to clamp down pieces for chopping operations or in operations where I'm trying to do waste removal on a flat facing piece. Now don't let the small stature of this workbench fool you. This is a heavy duty workbench, and by no means do I believe, based on the construction of this workbench, that the hand tool use that it'll see from me will even remotely move it. This thing is solid, rock solid. What's great is that it's small enough to be moved around within my shop, and that's why I installed these Rockler workbench casters here. This allows me to lift the workbench just slightly off the ground and move the workbench where I need it in case maybe I need some extra space to work around, or if I need to stow it away if I'm dealing with a lot of sheet goods in my shop. But it moves very nimbly around my shop without a problem. As a woodworker that uses predominantly power tools, I really can't see myself needing a workbench that's more complicated or bigger than this workbench. The workbench that I built, I really feel hit all the marks for the needs that I saw within my woodworking. Now I'll be honest with you, when I was designing and looking at workbenches, I really wanted to build that twin slab classic Roubo workbench with the bench crafted hardware and the wagon vise and all the very fancy things. But the more I looked at it, and the more I thought about the cost, and the more I thought about how big the workbench would be, it just really didn't make sense for me based on the kind of woodworking that I do. So I'd ask you, if you're looking at building a workbench, really assess what your needs are, look at how you work in your workshop, and then draw up a design that meets those needs. I hope you enjoyed what you watched, and if you did, hit the like or subscribe button, or hit both. And if you've got questions or comments, leave them below. Thanks for watching.